My son-in-law shoved a stack of papers across the marble kitchen island and sneered, "Sign the workshop over by tomorrow morning, old man." When I refused, he threw a glass of ice water straight into my face while his wealthy business partners watched and laughed. My daughter quietly sipped her wine and whispered, "Dad, it's just a building." I walked away without saying a word. The next morning, I handed him an envelope he eagerly tore open. Seconds later, his face turned white and he collapsed onto his own patio. Some details here have been shaped for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental, but what this story teaches is worth holding on to. The name I was given is Russell Hartley, 68 years old. For the better part of 2 years, I had been sleeping and waking in a converted workshop, nothing bigger than a 2-car garage, while my son-in-law occupied an 8-bedroom mansion, 50 FT away. That evening, planted inside that mansion's kitchen, something finally clicked into place, the thing Miriam had tried to tell me before she left this world. That kitchen alone dwarfed the whole first floor of the home where Leanne was raised. Every surface wore a coat of imported Italian marble. The refrigerator alone ran more than I paid for my first delivery truck. Garrett had conceived the space as a kind of theater, a room that shrank whoever walked into it, and more nights than I cared to admit it had that effect on me. Most nights, not tonight. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we go any further, drop a quick comment and tell me what the weather looks like where you are right now. There's something about knowing who's listening on the other side that makes a story like this feel a little less lonely to tell. A quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of telling it well. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. It's the truth underneath the story that I want you to carry with you. Russell Garrett Croft set his crystal whiskey glass down on the marble island with a sharp crack that rang off the vaulted ceiling. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, dressed in a navy blazer that probably cost $3,500. He had the kind of jawline that photographed well, and eyes that never quite met yours directly. "We need to talk. Right now." I had been over by the window, watching the last of the October light drain away across the backyard. At the far edge of the property stood the old workshop, its weathered pine walls catching the fading dusk in a pale glow. I turned to face him. "Then talk," I said. Garrett slid a stack of legal documents across the marble toward me, crisp pages freshly printed bound together with a wide black binder clip. He tapped the top sheet twice with one finger, the way a man does when he's reminding you who the smartest person in the room is. "This is a deed transfer agreement," he said. "Simple and straightforward. You sign the workshop over to me as collateral for a bridge loan I need by Monday morning. My new residential development in Brentwood is fully approved." The financing was 90% done, he explained. He just needed one additional piece of solid collateral to close the gap. The workshop sitting on his property was the cleanest asset available. I looked down at those documents. Every clause of fine print confirmed exactly what he'd described. A complete and unconditional transfer of ownership. Permanent. "That workshop is not yours to leverage, Garrett," I said, keeping my voice level. "Miriam and I built that structure with our own hands in 1986. It was the first building we ever owned. It carries no corporate designation, and it is not tied to any account you can touch." Garrett let out a short laugh, the kind that rises from the back of the throat, engineered to make the other person feel foolish. "With all due respect, Russell, that sheed sits on my land," he said, spreading his arms wide. "It's on my deed under my property taxes inside my fence line. You've been living there rent-free for 2 years because Leanne and I were generous enough to allow it. You eat from my kitchen, you run appliances on my electric bill, and you haven't put a single dollar into this household since you moved in after the funeral." Something tightened in my chest, that particular feeling when something true and something cruel arrive bound together at the same moment. "I am asking you not to do this," I said quietly. "That building carried meaning for your wife's mother. It carries meaning for me. Find another way to secure your financing." Garrett came around the island, closing the space between us until I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "There is no other way," he said, his voice falling lower and harder. "And frankly, I'm done walking carefully around your feelings about a rotting wooden shack. You're a 68-year-old widower with no income, no investments, and no plan. You ought to be grateful we haven't placed you in an assisted living facility already." I turned toward Leanne. She was positioned on the far side of the island, one hip resting against the counter, a glass of red wine cradled in her hand. She wore an ivory linen blouse and her mother's pearl earrings, the ones I had given Miriam on their 25th anniversary. I studied my daughter's face, waiting for anything at all, a frown, a single word, the faintest signal that she still knew me as her father. Leanne took a slow sip and looked just past my left shoulder. "Garrett makes a valid point, Dad," she said. Her voice was smooth, and even the way a rehearsed line sounds when someone has gone over it more than once. "You've been here 2 years. We've never asked you for anything. The least you can do is help Garrett when he needs it. It is just a building." Those 4 words landed somewhere behind my sternum and didn't move. It is just a building. I looked back at Garrett and pushed the documents firmly across the marble toward him. "My answer is no," I said. "It won't change tonight, and it won't change in the morning. That workshop is not for sale, not for collateral, and not open for discussion." Garrett's jaw went tight. The polished surface cracked at the edges, and what showed underneath was something uglier, something that had likely always been there, waiting for a moment exactly like this. "You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider," he said, his voice drawn taut as a wire on the verge of snapping. "Because if you don't sign those papers, I'll have my attorney begin formally reclassifying that structure as an unauthorized occupancy on my registered property. And then you won't merely lose the workshop, you'll lose any right to be on this land at all." From the adjacent dining room came a low murmur. 3 men in expensive suits were seated at the long walnut table, Garrett's prospective business partners, who had arrived an hour earlier with firm handshakes and hungry eyes. They had plainly heard every word. One shifted in his chair and leaned toward another, murmuring something I couldn't catch. I stood completely still and watched my son-in-law. He was breathing harder than the exchange called for, his hand resting near his whiskey glass on the island, fingers curved slightly inward. I kept my eyes on that hand. He reached for the glass, and something cold moved through me before I fully understood what was coming. The water struck before I could step back. Garrett swept the crystal glass off the marble in one hard motion, and the ice water caught me full across the face, cold enough to stop my breath entirely. Ice cubes struck my forehead, glanced off the bridge of my glasses, and clattered loudly across the marble floor. The water streamed down my nose, soaked into the collar of my cardigan, and dripped steadily from my chin onto the polished stone beneath me. From the dining room, one of the business partners made a short, harsh sound, almost a laugh, before pulling it back. Garrett loomed over me, chest heaving, the empty crystal glass still gripped in his hand. His face was flushed deep red, and his expression carried something that looked almost like satisfaction, as though he'd been wanting to do that for a long time, and it had felt precisely as good as he'd imagined. "You are a freeloader, Russell," he said, leveling the glass at my chest. "A pathetic, useless old man who has been eating my food and breathing my air for 2 years without contributing one single thing to this family. You will sign those papers by tomorrow morning, or I will have security clear every piece of junk you own out of that workshop and change the locks tonight. Do you understand me?" Water was still running down the side of my neck. My glasses had fogged over. My cardigan hung cold and heavy against my shoulders. I didn't raise my hand to wipe my face. I didn't raise my voice. What I did was turn my head slowly to the right, toward my daughter. Leanne was still holding her wine glass. She hadn't moved through any of it. She was looking at me now, at my dripping face, at the ice scattered on the floor, at the humiliation her husband had staged in front of 3 strangers. Her pearl earrings caught the light above the island. She blinked once. Then she turned away, moved smoothly around the island, and stepped into the dining room to join the guests. She said something to one of the men in a warm, easy tone, as though she had simply slipped away to refresh her drink. My heart did not break in that moment. It had already been fracturing slowly across 2 years. What happened then was more like the last thread finally releasing, quiet and absolute, the way an old rope gives out, not with a snap, but with a sigh. I turned and walked out of the kitchen. The October air hit my wet face like a second blow, colder and more honest than the first. I crossed the back lawn through the dark, my shoes sinking gently into the soft grass, the mansion's lights throwing long shadows across the yard. The workshop waited ahead, its pine walls pale beneath the moonlight. I stepped inside and slid the deadbolt home. I took off my glasses and dried them on the hem of my undershirt. My hands were steady, which caught me off guard. I had expected them to tremble. Then the memory came the way it always did when I stood inside this building alone at night. Miriam perched on the low wooden stool in the corner, a battery lantern balanced on an overturned wooden crate at her side, its glow spilling across the open book in her lap. 1986, 2 years into our marriage. We had nothing to speak of. She glanced up at me from above her reading glasses and smiled. "You know what I love most about this place, Russell? Tell me," I said, still drawing the hand plane along a piece of red oak. "It smells like something real," she said. "Something you made with your own hands, nothing borrowed, nothing rented. Ours." I pressed my shoulders against the workshop wall and stood there, letting the full weight of what had unfolded inside that kitchen settle over me. Then I moved to the bed, knelt down and peeled back the worn, braided rug from the baseboard. Underneath the seam of a loose floorboard was barely distinguishable in the darkness. And beneath that board was something I hadn't laid a hand on in 5 years, something I had carried the quiet hope of never needing again. I had the combination memorized in my fingers. 4, right 2, left 1 right. The lock gave way with a firm, clean click that seemed to fill the silence of the workshop. 3 items sat inside the black steel box. The first was a satellite phone, matte black military-grade encryption, built to stay off commercial cell networks and beyond the reach of ordinary tracking. I had acquired it in 2018 through a private security consultant in Washington, back when Hartley Woodcraft and Design was still running at its peak. It hadn't been switched on since the week following Miriam's funeral. The second item was a small silver memory card bound in a strip of black electrical tape, holding encrypted duplicates of every financial document, trust record, and corporate filing tied to the blind trust I had set up after selling Hartley Woodcraft and Design to a private equity group in late 2020 for $1.2 billion. Everyone on the outside, Leanne included, had been led to believe the company had quietly collapsed beneath the pressure of medical bills and mismanagement in the aftermath of Miriam's illness. What had actually happened was that the entire transaction ran through the blind trust under a non-disclosure agreement that locked every public record away. The buyers had promptly relaunched the operation under a different name, which made following the money all but impossible unless you already knew the path. That version of events had been painstakingly built, legally sealed, and held in place ever since. The third item was a letter. The envelope had aged to the color of old bone, the paper inside gone soft at the creases from years of being folded and unfolded. Miriam's handwriting across the front was neat and close. The letters pressed slightly narrow, the way her hand moved whenever she was writing something she intended to outlast the moment. "For the day you need to remember who you are." She had placed it in my palm on the morning of her last lucid day 4 years ago, in a room on the 4th floor of Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She had been 59 years old. Her grip on my hand had been fierce enough to drain the color from her knuckles, and she had fixed me with that particular directness she reserved for things she needed to make sure I would carry with me. But so she had said, her voice stripped thin but still sure. "The money won't shield Leanne from her own choices. Only she can do that. What you can do is keep what we built from being turned into a weapon aimed at you." I had told her she was borrowing trouble. I had told her Leanne was our daughter and that everything was going to be fine. Now I sat on the edge of the cot, the envelope lying across both palms, and I felt that particular ache that belongs to being wrong about someone you love. It settles in the chest, first, then spreads, not sharp, not sudden, but heavy and slow, the way cold infiltrates a building through its own walls. I placed the letter on the workbench next to the lantern. I wasn't prepared to open it yet. Certain things demand to be approached with patience. I reached for the satellite phone instead. The screen took 90 seconds to come to life, working through a series of encrypted prompts before arriving at a clean interface. I tracked the signal meter as it climbed to 4 bars. Secure connection established. I dialed from memory. 2 rings. "Russell." Owen Bassett's voice was measured and unhurried, the voice of someone who had long since stopped minding calls that came at difficult hours. He was 65 years old, a corporate attorney who had been alongside me for 3 decades, first as outside counsel for Hartley Woodcraft, then as the architect of the blind trust that had kept my financial life completely hidden for the past 3 years. Beyond 2 federal accountants, he was the only person on earth who held the whole picture of what I owned. "It's me, Owen," I said. "I've been expecting this," he said. His voice carried no surprise, only the measured calm of a man who had been watching something from a distance and had known for some time where it was heading. "How long have you been watching him?" I asked. "I've 14 months," Owen said. "Since you asked me to start. I didn't want to come to you until I had enough to be sure. Russell, I have enough." My jaw set. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "How bad?" I asked. Owen drew a slow breath out through his nose, the habit he had when the news he was carrying wasn't news he wanted to give. "Bad enough that tonight is the night," he said. "Not tomorrow. It has to be tonight. There's a timing problem I need to walk you through face to face. Meet me at the Cornerstone Diner on Broadway. 40 minutes. I got to my feet. Through the workshop's small window, the mansion still blazed warm and gold against the dark October sky. Somewhere in those lit rooms, Leanne was topping off her wine and keeping the conversation easy with her husband's investors, and the man she had helped build up had no idea that the foundation beneath his Italian marble had quietly begun to give. "I'll be there in 30, I said. I did up the buttons of my cardigan over my still damp collar, tucked the envelope into my inside breast pocket, and held it there flat against my chest, right where Miriam had always said the things that mattered most belonged. I stepped out and pulled the workshop door locked behind me. The night air carried dried leaves and the first edge of rain. Nashville hummed in the distance, unhurried and indifferent, the way a city carries on while one man's world quietly shifts beneath him in the dark. The Cornerstone Diner on Broadway was the sort of place that existed in a permanent in-between, never quite shut, never quite alive. At 2:00 in the morning, the overhead lights ran dim. The coffee tasted like it had been on the burner too long and didn't apologize for it. A long-haul driver was working through a slice of pie at the counter, and a night shift nurse sat in the far booth, eyes on her phone. No one gave me a second glance on the way in. I took the rear corner booth sightlines to the front door, and the kitchen passed through both clear, a reflex left over from years of sitting across negotiating tables in rooms where knowing who was coming and going was part of the job. I ordered black coffee from a waitress who looked wrung out, but had kind eyes wrap my hands around the mug and settled in. Owen Bassett came through the glass door at 2:12. He was a big man, wide through the chest and shoulders, and even at 65 the solidity hadn't left him, with close-cropped silver hair and an unhurried stride built from a lifetime of never having to prove his standing in a room. He had on a dark cashmere overcoat and was carrying the same leather briefcase I'd been looking at for 30 years. The very one he'd set on the closing table the day we executed the original incorporation papers for Hartley Woodcraft and Design in a conference room on South Broadway in 1990. He settled into the booth across from me, put the briefcase down beside him, and his eyes went straight to my collar. "Your shirt's still wet," he said. "It happened about 2 hours ago," I said. His jaw shifted. He ordered coffee without touching the menu, waited until the waitress was gone, and brought his forearms down onto the table. "Before we open anything, I need to say something," he said. "I've known you 30 years, Russell. I was there watching you build that company out of a rented warehouse with used equipment. I watched you sit beside Miriam every single day through her last 6 months. And I watched you take up residence in a workshop and pull on the same 3 sweaters for 2 years because you weren't willing to be far from your daughter." He stopped and pressed his mouth tight. "What Garrett Croft did tonight is assault. We could have a criminal complaint filed by morning and an arraignment done before the weekend ends." I moved my head slowly side to side. "A misdemeanor hands him something he can contain," I said. "I don't want to inconvenience him. I want to dismantle him." Owen held my gaze for a beat, then gave one slow nod, the nod he always produced when he'd concluded that a client knew precisely what they were after. "Then let me show you what we have," he said. He unlatched the briefcase and drew out a thick manila folder, placing it flat on the table between us. The tab carried a date range January through October 2023 and a single name. "Garrett Croft is not merely in financial trouble," Owen said, opening to the first tabbed section. "His residential development portfolio has been drowning since February. 3 projects in Brentwood and 1 in Germantown, all bleeding cash, all carrying debt he has no way to service. He is into private lenders for over $4 million lenders who are not known for their patience." Owen pressed a finger to the top page. "He's been shuffling money between shell accounts to manufacture the impression of liquidity. Classic float scheme. The float dried up 6 weeks ago. That's why he came after the workshop," I said. My voice landed flatter than I expected. He needed fresh collateral because every other asset he holds is already spoken for. "Exactly," Owen said, "but here's where things get considerably worse. He turned to the second tabbed section and angled the folder toward me. My forensic accountant flagged this 8 months ago and spent the following 6 months building the documentation before he'd let me bring it to you. I looked down at the page, a loan agreement from a private lending firm headquartered in Memphis. The figure on the opening line, $450,000. The date, February of this year. At the bottom on the line, marked primary guarantor, was my name, Russell R. Hartley. The signature beneath it was not mine. I stared at it. My chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the damp cardigan. "He practiced it," Owen said quietly. Our handwriting analyst confirmed he likely worked from samples, greeting cards, grocery lists, anything bearing your signature that moved through that house. He put real time into this, Russell. Nothing impulsive about it. I turned to the next page. Another loan, $600,000. March, my name again, the same patient imitation of my hand at the bottom. "How many?" I asked. 4 agreements, Owen said. Spread across 8 months combined, total of $2.1 million, all secured against the workshop property, using a fabricated appraisal that described it as an unencumbered asset. He paused. A promissory note, for context, is a written commitment to repay a specific debt. By forging your name as guarantor, Garrett made you legally liable for $2.1 million in loans you never agreed to and never knew existed. My coffee had gone cold. I pushed the cup aside. "Russell," Owen said, "there is one more thing in this folder. I need you to prepare yourself before you look at it." He reached across and turned to the final tabbed section, and the name on the cosigner line of the third agreement drove the air straight out of my lungs. The name was Leanne Croft, not a forgery. I had watched my daughter form that exact signature since she was old enough to grip a pen, the slightly elongated L, the way the final E looped back on itself. That signature was entirely hers, written with the steady confidence of someone who had not paused before putting pen to paper. I turned to the next agreement, her signature again, and the one after that. 3 out of 4 contracts. $2.1 million borrowed against my name and my property, and my daughter had sat beside her husband at some table in some room I would never see, and signed her name to documents that made me financially responsible for his fraud. My throat closed until swallowing was an effort. "She knew," I said. The words came out rougher than I intended, scraped raw on the way up. "She knew," Owen confirmed. His voice went careful the way it does when he is delivering something he wishes weren't true. "She didn't merely co-sign. According to the account records, the loan proceeds landed directly in a joint account held by both Garrett and Leanne. She had full access and made withdrawals from that account within days of each deposit." I pressed my palm flat against the tabletop. The laminate was cold and faintly tacky, the texture of a surface scrubbed down 10,000 times and never quite restored. I focused on that feeling because it was solid and immediate and asked nothing of me. It didn't hold for long. She had worn Miriam's pearl earrings tonight. She had stood in that kitchen and told me I owed them for the roof above my head, already fully aware that she had helped drain $2 million using my name. The earrings, the wine, that smooth, rehearsed voice. "Tell me about the workshop appraisal," I said, because I needed to understand the full structure of what they had constructed together. Owen turned to a new section. Garrett commissioned a private appraisal of the workshop and the land it sits on. The appraiser he chose has a documented history of producing inflated valuations for clients with particular needs. The report described the workshop as a freestanding residential dwelling on an independently zoned parcel, valued at $900,000, free and clear of any encumbrance. Owen looked at me across the top of the folder. "None of that is accurate. The structure is legally classified as an accessory building on the main residential parcel. It cannot be separately encumbered without your explicit written consent and a formal partition filing. The entire collateral basis for these loans is fraudulent, which means the lenders are victims as well." "Correct," I said. "Private lending firms operating outside standard bank regulation," Owen said. "They failed to do adequate due diligence, but they were still defrauded. That shapes how authorities will handle this." I closed the folder and rested both hands on the cover. The fluorescent light above the booth flickered once steadied and resumed its hum. The truck driver at the counter was settling his bill. Out on the street, a delivery truck rolled past the window, its headlights sweeping briefly across wet asphalt. I thought about the summer Leanne turned 16. She had come home one afternoon with a bruise on her forearm, where a classmate had shoved her into a locker. She hadn't broken down in front of her friends. She'd held it together until she reached the workshop, climbed up onto the workbench stool the way she'd done since she was small, and then let herself fall apart. I'd sat beside her for 2 hours, not rushing her, not trying to solve it, just remaining there. When she finally stopped crying, she said, "You're the only person who never makes me feel stupid for being sad." I had believed that meant something that would last. Russell. Owen's voice brought me back. "There's one more folder. I debated whether to bring it tonight." He reached into the briefcase again. "I decided you needed the full picture before Monday." My eyes went to the slim envelope he set on the table. It was unlike the financial documents, lighter, more deliberate somehow. "What happens Monday?" I asked, though something in my gut had already begun to understand. "That's what's in here," Owen said. He rested 2 fingers on the envelope without opening it. "Garrett contacted a probate attorney 6 weeks ago. They've been corresponding by email through his company server." He paused. "Russell, a probate attorney in Tennessee, specializes in estate law, and in certain cases, legal guardianship proceedings, the kind where a family member petitions a court to have an elderly relative declared legally incompetent." The coffee cup in front of me seemed to recede. Owen slid the envelope across the table. I looked at my own name, printed on the opening line of the document inside, listed not as a person, but as a subject. The document was titled, "Petition for Emergency Conservatorship of Russell R. Hartley." I read it the way you read "Something You Already Know Will Wound You Slowly, one line at a time, giving each word its full weight before moving to the next." A conservatorship, Owen explained before I could ask, is a legal arrangement in which a court removes an adult's right to govern their own affairs, financial and personal, and transfers that authority to another party. In Tennessee, an emergency conservatorship can be granted, without the subject even appearing at the initial hearing, based solely on the petitioner's sworn testimony and a supporting affidavit. Once a judge signs the temporary order, the subject loses the legal right to access their own accounts, make their own medical decisions, enter into contracts, or, in some cases, even determine where they live. That temporary order could sit on the books for months before a full hearing ever got scheduled. Garrett had already prepared the petition ready to be filed the moment the courthouse opened Monday morning. The grounds he'd listed: rapidly progressing cognitive decline, verbal and physical aggression toward family members, and inability to manage my own affairs or keep myself safe. I turned to the affidavit section. Leanne's name was at the top, the whole thing written in her voice. "My father has shown increasing signs of confusion and disorientation over the past several months. He frequently misplaces items and becomes agitated when asked simple questions. On the evening of October 11th, he became verbally threatening toward my husband during a routine household discussion and had to be physically restrained to prevent harm to others. I am deeply concerned for his safety and for the safety of those around him. Placement in a secure memory care facility is, in my professional judgment, as his closest next of kin, the only compassionate course of action remaining." October 11th was tonight. The routine household discussion was Garrett demanding my signature on a deed transfer, then emptying a glass of ice water across my face. She had composed this before any of it happened. She had written the affidavit first, then dropped the date in after the fact. My hands were still. That surprised me, same as it had 2 hours earlier in the workshop. But pressure gathered behind my eyes, slow and accumulating, with nowhere to go. I had to lay the document on the table and pinch the bridge of my nose between my thumb and finger for a moment before I could continue. "She'd been cataloging me," I said. "Weeks of watching, looking for material." "Almost certainly," Owen said. "The petition cites at least 4 separate incidents in the past 2 months. Reading glasses that went missing. A habit of taking your meals alone in the workshop rather than at the main table. One instance where you apparently didn't turn around when Leanne called your name from across the yard." His voice went flat. "She took every unremarkable behavior of a grieving 68-year-old man living quietly by himself and dressed it up as clinical evidence." I brought my gaze down to my own hands resting on the tabletop. Those hands had pushed a belt sander across 10,000 board feet of hardwood, had signed documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had held Miriam's hand through every night of the final 2 years of her life, including the nights she no longer remembered my name, but still searched for my hand in the dark. A memory surfaced without permission, the way the ones that cost the most always do. Miriam, 11 days before the end, turning her face toward me in that hospital room, voice stripped nearly to nothing, but her eyes sharp and present. "Russell, I need you to promise me something. Anything, I said. Promise me you won't let them turn your love for Leanne into the thing they use against you. Love isn't surrender. You showed me that. Don't let yourself forget it. I kissed her hand and gave her my word. I worked through the petition to the last page. Then I straightened it against the table's edge and set it down and looked across at Owen. The plan is to get me declared incompetent, I said, so Garrett can go after the blind trust. That's almost certainly where this ends up, Owen said. If Leanne is appointed conservator, she gains the legal standing to demand access to your financial records. The blind trust has solid walls around it, but a court-backed challenge with conservatorship authority driving it could cause enough interference to crack the structure open. And the filing happens Monday, I said. Before you'd have any warning. Owen confirmed. I let my weight settle back into the booth. Around us, the diner carried on in its quiet, half-alive way. The waitress was dragging a cloth along the counter. The nurse in the far booth had gone still phone-tipped sideways in her hand. Through the window, the blackness beyond the glass was beginning to soften, not yet dawn, but something adjacent to it. I reached into my breast pocket and drew out Miriam's letter. I opened it gradually, using my thumb to ease the old folds flat. Her handwriting neat and compressed across paper that had yellowed at the edges, and I was reading her words for the first time since the morning she placed them in my hands. And Russell, if you are reading this, then the thing I was afraid of has happened. I want you to know that I am not angry, and I do not want you to be angry either. Anger burns the person who carries it. What I want you to feel is clear. Clear about who you are. Clear about what we built together. And clear about the fact that no one, not Garrett, not Leanne, not anyone, has the right to take that from you. You did not build Hartley Woodcraft and Design by losing your nerve. Do not lose it now. I love you, I am proud of you, do not xiao ai jiao. That final line she had written in Vietnamese, a language she had learned from a neighbor in our first apartment 30 years ago, one she'd kept as a private language between us, ever since reserved for the moments when ordinary words weren't enough. It meant, do not bow your head. I refolded the letter and tucked it back against my chest. Owen, I said, Monday morning is our deadline. Tell me what we're going to do between now and then. Owen sat up straighter, flipped to a clean page on his legal pad, and brought his pen to bear. I've been waiting for you to ask that, he said. He worked through the opening moves with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the difference between a plan and a mess was the quality of preparation. Don't tell me what you think you can get, he said. Tell me what you actually want. I closed both hands around my cold mug and gave it a moment. The booth hummed with the low ambient sound of the diner, fluorescent lights at half power, overhead the waitress topping off the truck driver's cup at the far end of the counter without being asked. Out on Broadway, Nashville had settled into the stillest version of itself it ever managed, which was still not very still, a delivery truck grinding over the overpass, in the distance headlights skimming the wet street in long, slow arcs. I want the workshop standing when this is over, I said. Not just legally shielded, untouched. I want Garrett to finally understand that he had no claim on that building, not 1 hour of the 2 years I was living there. Owen made a note without lifting his eyes from the pad. Go on. I want him holding whatever I give him tomorrow morning while his investors are in the room. I said, standing in that linen suit with those 3 men looking on, reading every word, and I want there to be no door left open by the time he reaches the end. Owen raised his eyes from the legal pad. His face stayed composed, but something in his focus sharpened the expression of a man who has just received exactly the brief he was built for. All of that is within reach, he said, but the timing is tight. Let me walk you through how the pieces fit. He rotated the legal pad so I could read along as he wrote. We start with the foreclosure. Garrett took out a $4.2 million mortgage on that property through a boutique lending firm called Cumberland Bridge Capital. What he has never known is that Cumberland Bridge Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of a holding company inside your blind trust. From the moment he signed those loan documents, you were the creditor standing behind them. I said nothing. I had kept that from Leanne, from everyone in fact except Owen and the 2 accountants who held the trust's inner architecture. When Garrett had settled into a chair across from a Cumberland Bridge Capital loan officer 3 years ago, thanking him for the rate, pleased with himself for the deal. He thought he'd negotiated, he'd been shaking hands with a man who worked for me. 3 years of believing he'd beaten the system. 3 years of his mortgage payments landing in my account. Right now he is 2 payments behind. Owen said pen, moving in short, deliberate strokes. The agreement he signed specifies that a third missed payment triggers an automatic default. No judge needs to weigh the facts. No hearing has to be arranged. We file the foreclosure notice directly, and under Tennessee law, from the moment that notice is recorded, with the county register of deeds, the property enters legal default and becomes subject to seizure proceedings within 72 hours. Tonight, I said, it gets recorded the instant the register of deeds opens at 8 tomorrow morning, Owen said. By 9, it's public record. By 10, pull a title search on that property and it comes back as a defaulted asset sitting under active foreclosure. The moment Garrett tries to pledge it against anything before this resolves, he layers fresh fraud on top of what is already documented. I kept returning to the image of him in that kitchen, the way he had slid a sheaf of legal papers across the marble island, smooth and unhurried, telling me the workshop occupied his land, that I ought to count myself fortunate to have a roof at all. And behind him, framed in the dining room doorway, 3 business partners looking on, one of them laughing when the water hit my face. Second, I said. Second, the asset freeze. Owen drew a slow, intentional line beneath the first item on his pad, the same thing he always did when moving from one pillar of a strategy to the next. A practice hammered into him across 30 years of building cases that had to withstand real scrutiny. The evidentiary record we had assembled over 14 months was more than adequate to anchor an emergency injunction request. He would submit to the federal court that night under their emergency filing protocol. A duty magistrate is available around the clock to evaluate urgent injunction requests, provided the evidentiary bar is cleared, and what we had cleared it with room to spare. Once satisfied, the magistrate issues an order that locks every financial account tied to Garrett and Leanne Croft, while the fraud investigation proceeds. Checking accounts, savings business and operating accounts, credit lines, investment portfolios, all of it. Every number drops to 0 the instant the order takes effect. When would that be? I asked. Sign-off from the magistrate would come that night. Owen was certain of it, given what we had. The freeze would land at 8 the following morning, same instant the foreclosure notice hit the record. Saturday. Garrett settles in to receive his brunch guests, raises a glass of champagne with his investors, and in that same breath, every financial avenue available to him goes dark. He will not feel it at first. But a man like him checks his accounts early, reaches for a card on reflex. The discovery would come within the hour. I let out a slow breath. The constriction that had been sitting behind my sternum since that kitchen evening began to release, not fully, but the way tension yields when you find the correct thread in a knot and work it with patience instead of pulling hard. And the conservatorship petition, I said. Owen knocked his pen against the legal pad twice. Move tonight, and by the time Monday's business day opens, Garrett will have no active bank account and nothing liquid to speak of. A conservatorship petition cannot be filed without first engaging a probate attorney. Engaging an attorney means writing a check. Writing a check means having access to funds he will no longer possess. Owen paused. The petition collapses before any courthouse ever sees it. A legal system costs money to wield, and he will be out of it. I let that settle. The conservatorship petition was the piece that had taken the air out of me when Owen laid it on the table 40 minutes earlier. The fraud, venal, deliberate, ugly as it was, still registered as a recognizable human failing. Greed at least has a logic you can trace. What Garrett and Leanne had constructed in that petition was a different order of wrong entirely. They had looked at a 68-year-old man keeping to himself in a workshop, his books, his garden, his grief lived quietly and privately as grief demands, and they had characterized him as a threat to his own safety and to others. Invented symptoms, ordinary solitude repackaged as clinical deterioration, and they intended to raise their right hands before a judge and affirm it. The money was not the whole of it. They had wanted to extinguish him. The envelope, I said. The words came out more controlled than the feeling behind them. 3 documents go inside. The foreclosure notice, the fraud filing summary, and a full printed copy of the conservatorship petition rendered exactly as Garrett wrote it, so that he understands with complete certainty that I have read every word he put to paper about me. Owen permitted himself a thin, sober smile, the variety that stops well short of the eyes and is not designed to reach them. That is a precise instrument. He wanted a document from me, I said. He stood in that kitchen and gave me until morning to sign over the deed or face the street. so I will deliver him exactly what he requested, a document arriving right on the schedule he set. Across the diner table, Owen held my eyes for a moment, the fluorescent light washing evenly over the pad between us, and I could read what was happening behind his expression. He was walking the whole sequence forward, testing the timing, locating the weak joints, deciding what he would do if any of them gave. That was Owen's method. Laying out a plan was only the first move. He would then take it apart from the outside, finding every scenario where it could fail before he ever committed to executing it. There is one vulnerability I want to name. He said that Garrett, upon reading those documents, would not stay composed. Frightened, cornered people act without logic. He might try to shift funds ahead of the freeze. He might go straight to the private lenders. He might decide to put distance between himself and the state. Could he move anything meaningful before 8? I asked. Nothing significant, Owen said. The private lenders had been reached through back channels they already knew. The collateral on their loans was under active scrutiny. Disbursements were voluntarily suspended pending that review. His conventional banking relationships would stall any large Saturday morning transfer behind standard verification, and the crypto accounts he had been running as a parallel off-book ledger were already tagged in the fraud filing. Owen put down one final note. He is not going anywhere with anything. I turned toward the diner window, looking out at Broadway lying quiet in the dark. Pre-dawn was still an hour from showing itself. The sky over the office towers held the same solid black it had worn since midnight. Owen shut the legal pad and returned the folders to his briefcase with the unhurried precision of someone readying themselves for a sustained engagement. He squared the tabs, confirmed the sequence, and brought the brass latches home with 2 sharp, clean snaps. Then his eyes came back to me across the table. "Russell," he said, the word arriving at a lower register, the courtroom composure of the past hour giving way to something with longer roots between us. The tone of 2 men whose acquaintance ran deep enough to say what had no place in the formal strategy. The workshop. I need to be certain I understand it. Is there anything inside the property's legal structure that requires separate protection? Filing an encumbrance, any thread Garrett's attorneys might pull on once the proceedings begin. I thought about Miriam on that low wooden stool in 1986, the battery lantern balanced on an overturned wooden crate at her side, the quiet rhythm of pages turning while I worked across the room. I thought about the smell of raw pine and linseed oil inside a rented storage unit that had grown without any deliberate intention into the true starting point of our life together. I thought about what Garrett had announced he would put in its place: a pool. An imported stone surround the sort of feature engineered to photograph well in a listing. That workshop predates the company, I said. It was there before the money, before the trust, before any structure existed around any of it. Miriam and I raised it from lumber we purchased on a payment plan out of a salvage yard on Nolensville Pike. We paid $9 a board foot for the pine framing because that was the most affordable structural wood on the lot. The concrete for the footings we mixed ourselves one Saturday morning, rented mixer, borrowed level. I stopped. It never appeared in any corporate filing because there was never a reason for it to. What it belongs to runs deeper than anything a deed describes. Owen placed his pen on the closed pad and held his gaze on me without filling the silence. Then we protect it by the same measure, he said at last. Not on account of its value as an asset, because it is yours. He lifted his briefcase, rose from the seat, fastened his coat, and put his hand out over the table. I took it. The grip was what it had been 30 years ago, in that conference room on South Broadway, steady and without hurry. The handshake of a man whose word was the same as his commitment. Beyond the diner window, Broadway was waking in fragments, the first delivery trucks rolling through the thin October darkness, their headlights drawing long, pale lines across the pavement. The city resuming its vast, unhurried indifference one more morning, assembling itself from the dark. "The courier will have the envelope at the workshop by 9, Owen said. "Try to get some sleep." "I will not sleep," I said. He gave one nod, the kind that meant he had known the answer before the question left my mouth. "No," he said. I did not think so. I watched him push through the glass door and step out into the darkened street, his dark cashmere overcoat catching the neon spill from the diner sign as he rounded the corner. I ordered a second cup of coffee I had no real use for. There in the corner booth of the Cornerstone Diner on Broadway, alone inside the particular stillness that belongs to a city at 3, in the morning, I held Miriam's letter through the fabric of my jacket and waited for the sun to do what it has always done, indifferent to whatever any of us had built or broken in the hours before it arrived. I drove back to the Belmead property through the dark, left the 14-year-old Camry on the service road behind the workshop, and came in through the side door without reaching for the main light. The workshop held its familiar smell, pine resin linseed oil, and beneath those the faint mineral coolness of old concrete under the wood floor. 2 years of waking to that scent every morning and setting it down each night, and I had never grown indifferent to it. Sleep was not something I attempted. I settled into the wooden chair beside the workbench and let the quiet collect around me. My thoughts kept finding their way back to Miriam. Not the Miriam of the hospital, not the version the illness had drawn slowly inward during those final months, but the Miriam of this place, this building, these walls, the years before anything had come apart. It was the spring of 1986. We had been married 2 years and were poor enough that we tracked our checking account balance on a notepad stuck to the refrigerator, updating it every time one of us spent anything at all. We had rented the workshop space for $195 a month from a soft-spoken older man named Bernard, who held a block of storage units on the west side of Nashville and had taken a liking to us because Miriam never showed up empty-handed. There was always a slice of whatever she had baked that week. The first morning, I turned the key in that workshop door and stepped into the empty space. I felt something I had not encountered since I was a boy. That specific thrill of a room that has not yet settled on what it intends to become. Miriam stood at my shoulder in her green canvas work apron, hair pulled back, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked at the bare concrete floor and the single bulb hanging overhead and said, "Russell, this is it. This is where it starts." "Miriam, it's a storage unit," I said. She laughed, and the sound of it expanded to fill every corner of that empty room. "Everything worth building starts somewhere like this," she said. "A garage, a kitchen table. The space is beside the point. What matters is the person standing in it." We worked side by side in that room for 3 years before the books could support a first hire. Miriam ran the accounts on a second-hand adding machine. I built the furniture. She moved it at weekend markets, church fairs, and out of the bed of our pickup truck in parking lots across Davidson County. She negotiated with the calm assurance of someone who understood that having nothing to lose was its own kind of advantage. One Tuesday evening in November, the rain came through the roof badly enough that we had to consolidate all the finished pieces into the one dry corner and perch on upturned buckets, watching the water find every pot and bowl we owned. Miriam studied the ceiling, then turned to me, then looked at the row of carefully finished oak side tables, catching the light of the overhead bulb, and said, "You know what? I think this might be the best night we've ever had." "The roof is leaking," I said. "I know," she said, "but look at what we built, Russell. Look at what we made with our own hands. Nobody handed us that. Nobody can take it either." I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and held them there in the dark of the workshop. She had been right about all of it. Right about the company. Right about what money does to people who are not ready for it. And right about Leanne. The one thing she had been wrong about was believing she would still be here when it reached its end. Through the workshop's small, high window, the eastern sky had shifted from solid black to the deep blue-gray that settles just before real dawn. Out on the main road, a car went by, with its radio going a country song, bleeding in and out as the vehicle moved through the dark. I got to my feet, crossed to the far wall, and pulled open the tall, narrow closet I had fitted into that corner during my first month in the space. On the top shelf, tucked behind a folded wool blanket, sat a long canvas garment bag with a brass zipper. I brought it down with care and laid it across the workbench. I unzipped it with the same deliberateness. The suit inside was charcoal gray, a bespoke cut from a tailor on Savile Row in London named Alistair, who had taken my measurements in the spring of 2018 during the final stage of negotiations for the Hartley Woodcraft and Design Facility sale. I had put it on twice, once for the signing, once for Miriam's funeral. I lifted it free and held it in my hands for a moment. The cloth was dense and finely woven, the kind that holds its shape without effort and makes no apologies for existing. I dressed slowly and with intention, the way you do when each step carries weight. White shirt, the dark silk tie Miriam had chosen herself at a shop on Fifth Avenue the year before her diagnosis. The charcoal jacket settling across the shoulders as though it had been made for this exact morning, which, in a sense, it had. I looked at my reflection in the small oval mirror mounted above the workbench. The man looking back was not the one Garrett Croft had doused with ice water 12 hours ago. That man was behind me. The man in the mirror had taken salvage lumber and a second-hand adding machine and built something Garrett Croft would never have the capacity to fully reckon with. A quiet knock at the side door interrupted the morning. I crossed the room and opened it. A young man in a courier jacket stood on the step with a thick white envelope in his hand, sealed with a red wax stamp. He offered it without a word turned and walked back down the service road to his waiting car. I took the envelope in both hands. It was heavier than it appeared. By 10 in the morning, Garrett had gathered his audience with the considered precision of someone who knew that wealth is only half substance, the other half being the selection of the right stage for it. From the workshop window, I watched the catering van come through the side gate, a white vehicle carrying a discreet logo on its door, the sort of outfit that charges $400 a head and keeps those figures off anything a guest might read. Two servers in black uniforms transferred silver trays onto the long cedar dining table on the back patio, arranging chilled shrimp and imported cheeses and small ceramic bowls of something that caught the October light. A third worked the champagne station at the table's far corner, with the focused efficiency of someone who had performed this exact ritual at this category of house for this category of man many times before. The three investors arrived in separate cars, all within 15 minutes of one another. I recognized the eldest at once, mid-60s, silver-haired, with the straight posture and measured gaze of someone who had accumulated serious money young and spent the years since learning the discipline required not to surrender it. He came out of a dark sedan, appraised the estate with the unhurried eye of a professional, valuing an asset rather than admiring a property, and greeted Garrett with the brief, firm handshake of a man who treated his time as a finite resource. The second investor was younger, mid-40s, athletic build, the kind who runs half marathons and finds a way to mention it within 3 sentences of any introduction. He arrived carrying a leather portfolio and spent the first 5 minutes photographing the stone facade of the main house on his phone, which told me everything about the way he arrived at decisions. The third was quieter, heavyset, with the composed watchfulness of someone who had learned over a long time that listening returns more than speaking. He accepted a glass of champagne, held it without drinking, and placed himself slightly apart from the group, in the manner of someone who prefers to see the whole table at once. Garrett was in his element. A cream linen suit pressed to sharp creases, and around the patio, he moved with the open, unhurried ease of a man who has performed his own confidence so consistently that he has ceased to notice he is performing it. Before we get to what came next and what a man who believed he held every advantage was about to discover about himself, let me ask you something. If you found out that someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and let the truth do its own work? He laughed at precisely the right volume, swept a hand toward the estate with the ease of someone who had never questioned his right to it, and poured champagne with a generosity that communicated abundance more eloquently than any word could. He walked his guests through the Brentwood development project with the fluency of a man who had internalized his own pitch deck, projected returns, market timing, conservative risk modeling, delivered in the warm, confiding register of someone inviting you into a secret rather than closing a sale. Leanne was at his side in a champagne silk blouse, her mother's pearl earrings, picking up the October light with each turn of her head. She smiled at the correct intervals, laid a hand on Garrett's arm, at the moments they had clearly rehearsed, and directed the catering staff with the quiet authority of a woman who had performed this role often enough that it no longer required thought. She was accomplished at it. I had watched her grow accomplished at it over 2 years, the way you observe someone refine a skill that has no bearing on who they actually are underneath it. I stood at the workbench inside the workshop, the sealed white envelope resting in my hands. The wax seal Owen had pressed into the back of it bore the mark of his firm, a small, understated impression that would mean nothing to anyone who did not know what it signified. To me, it signified 30 years of precision and trust, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had devoted his career to building instruments that performed exactly when they were called upon. I thought of Miriam, not a constructed memory with sharp edges and full detail, just her presence, the particular quality of the attention she gave when she was watching me do something she believed in. She had looked at me that way the morning I signed the original incorporation papers for the Hartley Woodcraft and Design Facility in 1990, sitting across a conference table on South Broadway in a blazer borrowed from her sister, because we were not yet the kind of people whose wardrobes matched the rooms we were being asked to occupy. She had given me that look every time I had done something that genuinely counted. I fastened the top button of my jacket, straightened the dark silk tie, and took up the envelope. The workshop door opened out onto a short wooden step, and then the stone path that followed the eastern edge of the lawn toward the back patio. I had walked that path several hundred times, across 2 years, usually in worn khaki trousers and a cardigan, head angled slightly down, pace unhurried, the ambling drift of a man with no particular destination. I had cultivated that walk with care. I had worn it the way a skilled actor wears a costume completely without self-awareness, because the part demanded it. I did not walk that way this morning. The October air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp stone, and the faint rich smell of the catered food laid out on the patio. The grass still held the previous night's moisture, golden oak leaves pressed flat against the green. My leather shoes struck the stone path with a clean, measured sound, a steady rhythm that moved across the open lawn with the kind of quiet authority that has no need to introduce itself. The oldest investor noticed me first. He had been giving Garrett the politely attentive expression of a man withholding his verdict, while Garrett described the projected rental yields on the Brentwood development. Then his gaze traveled past Garrett's shoulder, crossed the lawn, and settled on me. What shifted in his face was small, but it was not nothing. The diplomatic attention condensed into something more alert, the focused instinct of a man whose experience had just received a signal his reasoning had not yet caught up with. He recognized the suit. He understood what the suit said about the man inside it. He set his champagne glass down on the cedar table with a soft, deliberate click. The second investor caught the gesture and tracked the first man's line of sight. The third investor, the quiet one who had kept himself slightly apart and watched the whole gathering, had already been watching me for 10 seconds. Garrett registered the change in his audience before he could account for it. He was mid-sentence somewhere in a passage about annualized returns when the room left him. He stopped. He turned. The smile did not vanish at once. It faltered a fraction of a second, an involuntary dimming in the expression of a man whose assurance had just absorbed a blow he had not anticipated before he rebuilt it into something broader and more deliberate than it had been, which made it worse because now it looked precisely like what it was. He murmured something to Leanne without breaking his gaze from me. She turned, found me on the lawn, and her face did something involuntary and complicated. Her jaw set. Her fingers adjusted their hold on the champagne flute. She looked at the envelope in my right hand, then at my face, and I watched her attempt to interpret what she found there and come up empty. Garrett moved across the patio toward me, with his hand already out his stride, carrying the ease of a man performing for the room, his voice pitched to reach the seated guests behind him. "Russell," he said, with the amplified warmth of a man enacting hospitality for an audience. "Glad you could join us this morning. I see you found yourself a nice jacket somewhere." He delivered the last line with practiced lightness, the kind of amusement calibrated to remind everyone within earshot of the distance between us. His attention dropped to the envelope in my hand, and something moved behind his eyes. A brightness, a hunger he was barely keeping in check. Is that what I think it is? I stopped walking when we were 3 ft apart. I held his gaze without offering him any expression he could use. The morning light fell direct and unsparing on his face, and I could see the effort working beneath the performance, the faint tightness at the outer corners of his eyes, the jaw set a degree harder than the easy smile above it had any reason to be. He was working. He had been working since the moment I stepped onto the lawn, and the work was consuming more of him than he wanted visible. "You asked me for a document," I said. My voice came out low and even, and reached the quiet patio without any effort at all. "I brought you exactly what you asked for." The oldest investor shifted forward slightly in his chair. The quiet one adjusted his stance. The athletic one stopped scrolling through the photographs he had taken of the stone facade. Garrett reached for the envelope with the unthinking confidence of a man reclaiming something already owed. His fingers closed around it, and I felt the pull as he moved to lift it from my grip. I did not let go right away. I held for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to feel the resistance. Long enough for the oldest investor, who was watching our hands with the concentrated attention of a man who had spent 40 years reading the physical grammar of deals, to register that what was unfolding was not the transaction Garrett had prepared him for. Then I released the envelope and stepped back. Garrett drew it against his chest, and the triumphant angle of his chin came back a beat too fast. A degree too pronounced, the overcorrection of a man who had felt the ground shift beneath him for 1 second and needed to bury the memory of it. He turned back to his guests wearing a wide smile and held the sealed envelope up briefly, a gesture just short of a flourish. "Gentlemen," he said, "excuse me just one moment." He split the red wax seal with his thumb. It broke cleanly, the two halves dropping to the stone patio. He reached in with his right hand and drew the thick sheaf of documents free with the composed certainty of a man who has already determined what he is about to discover. The October morning was very quiet. Beyond the garden wall, a car passed along the street and faded into the distance. The champagne in its glasses caught the sunlight and held it. Garrett looked at the first page. He pulled the first document free from the envelope with the unhurried confidence of a man opening a birthday card he was certain contained a check. He raised it toward the October sunlight, squinting against the dense legal text running across the top of the page. His lips moved faintly as he worked through the heading. Then they stopped. The color drained from his face the way water empties from an overturned glass, sudden, complete, and with no possibility of reversal. The document was a formal notice of mortgage default and foreclosure initiation issued by Cumberland Bridge Capital LLC, the boutique lending firm that had financed his $4.2 million property on Linwood Boulevard in Belle Meade. The notice stated that the borrower, Garrett T. Croft, had failed to satisfy his contractual payment obligations for 2 consecutive billing cycles, triggering the automatic default provision set out in Section 14C of the original mortgage agreement. Under Tennessee General Statute 4521, the creditor was hereby initiating foreclosure proceedings, and the subject property was subject to seizure and public auction within 72 hours of this notice. At the bottom of the page in clean black type was the name of the sole owner of Cumberland Bridge Capital, LLC, Russell R. Hartley. Garrett looked up from the page and fixed his eyes on me. His mouth had fallen slightly open. The confident angle of his chin from 30 seconds earlier had vanished entirely, replaced by something I had never once seen on his face. Raw, unguarded bewilderment, the expression of a man whose complete picture of a situation has just been ripped down the middle. "What is this?" he said. The words did not arrive as a question. They arrived as the sound a person produces when language briefly stops being available. "Keep reading," I said. His hands went to the second document. They were not entirely steady. The paper gave a faint rattle as he lifted it, a sound small enough that only the people nearest to him would have caught it. The oldest investor, the silver-haired man who had set his champagne glass down the moment I first crossed the lawn, leaned forward in his chair with the alert concentration of a man revising a significant calculation. The second document was a formal summary of the fraud investigation, filing submitted to the Tennessee Secretary of State's office and the Financial Crimes Division at 6:47 that morning. It laid out in plain, precise language that Garrett T. Croft had forged the signature of Russell R. Hartley on 4 separate promissory notes across an 8-month period, securing a combined total of $2.1 million from private lending institutions through fabricated collateral documentation and a fraudulent property appraisal. A promissory note is a legally binding written commitment to repay a debt. By forging Russell's signature as primary guarantor, Garrett had made Russell legally responsible for loans Russell had never agreed to and never known existed. The filing named Leanne Croft as a co-conspirator based on her voluntary co-signature on 3 of the 4 agreements and her direct receipt of the fraudulent loan proceeds into a joint account. Garrett read it twice. I watched his eyes travel back to the top of the page and begin again the way a person rereads a sentence, hoping the words will have rearranged themselves. They had not. One of the younger investors pushed back from the cedar table. The chair legs dragged across the stone patio with a sound like a starter pistol. He said something in a low voice to the man beside him, and both reached for their jackets. Garrett heard it. He turned toward his guests, and what he found on their faces dismantled the last intact piece of the morning he had so carefully assembled. The oldest investor was already on his feet. He lifted his linen napkin from the table, folded it once with the deliberate composure of someone who had already decided this meeting was over, and placed it beside his untouched plate. "Garrett," the man said, his voice carrying the flat and final register of a boardroom conclusion. "We're going to step out." Garrett opened his mouth. Nothing came. The three investors left the patio without a backward glance, their shoes quiet on the stone steps. They are bearing the coordinated withdrawal of men who could identify a burning building and understood they had no duty to remain inside it. Leanne crossed the patio in quick strides, her heels sharp against the stone, and seized Garrett by the arm. "Garrett, what is happening?" she demanded. Her voice wound tight with panic. She was working to hold beneath the surface. "Who are those people? Why are they leaving? What does that paper say?" Garrett did not answer. He was already pulling the third document from the envelope, his fingers working with the driven, unsteady urgency of someone who had to reach the bottom of something terrible and found themselves incapable of stopping. The third document was a printed email chain recovered from Garrett's company server correspondence between Garrett and a probate attorney in Germantown. Attached to the chain was a fully drafted petition for emergency conservatorship of Russell R. Hartley, complete with Leanne's signed affidavit, in which she had described her father as a danger to himself and others, and requested that he be placed in a secure memory care facility. Garrett stared at the printed email. The timestamp at the top showed it had been sent from his company account at 2:14 in the morning, less than an hour after I had walked out of that kitchen, with ice water still running down my face. He had written it that same night. His knees gave way. There was nothing dramatic about it, no warning, no attempt to brace himself. His legs simply ceased to hold him, and he went down hard onto the imported stone patio, the thick stack of legal documents scattering around him, the white pages lifting and drifting in the October breeze toward the feet of the empty chairs. Leanne screamed. His name broke from her as she dropped to her knees beside him, gripping his shoulders with both hands. Her voice fractured on the second syllable, a raw sound with nothing practiced in it. I stood at the edge of the patio and watched the pages come to rest across the stone. One sheet drifted against the leg of the chair where the oldest investor had been sitting. The fraud filing summary lay face up in the morning light, its words fully visible to anyone who chose to look. I straightened my jacket cuffs and waited. Garrett came back to himself gradually, the way a man does when his body has suspended operations to shield him from something his mind cannot absorb. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, drawing breath in ragged pulls, his cream linen suit carrying a dark stain where he had gone down near a dropped serving dish. Leanne had both palms on his back, her voice low and insistent, asking the same question 3 times without receiving an answer. "What does it say, Garrett? What is in those papers? Talk to me right now." Garrett got to his feet with Leanne's help, gripped her arm for balance, and half-walked, half-steered her through the glass patio doors into the living room. He did not look at me as he passed. I did not follow them inside. I walked back to the workshop, let myself in, and positioned myself at the window, where I could see through the floor-to-ceiling glass panels of the living room. I watched what unfolded next. The way you observe a storm from inside a structure, you know to be solid. Garrett found his phone first. He opened his banking application with unsteady fingers, and I watched his face cycle through 3 distinct expressions across roughly 8 seconds: concentration, then confusion, then the particular gray pallor of a man confronting a number that should not exist. He tapped the screen again and again, the same reflexive refresh of a person who keeps returning to the same action, hoping for a different result. The account balance was 0. The asset freeze Owen had filed at 6:47 that morning had executed precisely at 8:00 hours, the moment the financial court system came online. Every account connected to Garrett Croft, his personal checking, his business operating account, his real estate holding company, his high-limit credit lines had been suspended simultaneously pending the fraud investigation. Under federal financial crime statutes, an emergency asset freeze can be issued by a magistrate judge on documented evidence of ongoing fraud, preventing a suspect from moving or concealing money before formal charges are filed. Garrett had woken that morning believing he had $2 million and a bridge loan on its way. He now had nothing. Leanne crossed to him and took the phone from his hands. She looked at the screen, and her face changed in a way I had not witnessed before. The smooth, rehearsed composure she had maintained for 2 years, the same composure she had worn in that kitchen the previous night, while her husband humiliated her father, broke open entirely. Her chin began to tremble. Her eyes filled quickly, and 2 tears ran straight down her face before she pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth. She opened her own phone with fingers that shook visibly and went to her personal banking application. The account she kept separate from Garrett, the one reserved for her own expenditures and savings, the account she had counted on to be safely walled off from her husband's unraveling, showed the same figure. 0. 3 fraudulent loan agreements bore her signature. Stolen proceeds had landed directly in a joint account she shared with him. The emergency freeze order made no distinction. Her personal assets went down with everything else. Leanne flung her phone at the far wall. It struck tumbled onto the antique Persian rug, the screen shattering in a web of cracks from edge to edge. She wheeled on Garrett and seized the lapels of his ruined jacket in both fists, knuckles drained white, her voice shredding as she brought it directly into his face. "You told me it was a formality," she cried, the words coming out raw and ragged. "You said those papers were a technicality that Ba would never know, that it would all be settled before the loans matured. You said he was too far gone to notice. You lied to me, Garrett. You used me, and you lied to me, and now we have nothing." Garrett wrapped his hands around her wrists and worked to pry her grip loose. "Stop," he said, his voice gutted of anything. "Just stop and give me a moment to think." "There is nothing left to think about," Leanne cried, wrenching herself free. "They locked everything. It is all gone. What did you do to us? Tell me what you actually did." I moved away from the window. Satisfaction never came. I had believed it would somewhere across that long night of preparation, and it had stayed absent. What had found me instead was a specific kind of grief, the weight of watching someone you had given your life to finally stand fully revealed. Not through one decisive act, but through the slow layering of choices, each small enough to excuse a loan that had deposited them in this room on this morning. 2 people destroying each other over wealth that had never belonged to them. A memory rose before I had any defense against it. Leanne, at 8 years old, bursting through the workshop door after school and pulling herself up onto the tall workbench stool the way she always did, without asking, as if the stool had waited all day for her, specifically. She studied my hands working the sandpaper along the curved arm of a rocking chair. Her chin settled on her folded hands, eyes tracking every stroke. "Dad," she said, "does wood feel anything when you sand it?" "I think it feels like becoming something," I said. She sat with that in the thorough, unhurried way children handle ideas they take seriously. "Then it is probably not scared," she said, "because it knows it is going to be better after." I pressed the heel of my hand hard against the workbench edge and kept it there until something in me steadied. Then the sound reached me from the direction of the road, a siren still at a distance, but gaining, pushing through the stillness of that Saturday morning toward Belle Meade. Both patrol cars cleared the front gate at 11:14, running their lights without the sirens, the measured approach officers use when they want to read a scene before committing to a response. From the workshop porch, I watched them angle their vehicles across the circular driveway. 4 officers climbed out, moving with the composed patience of people who had answered enough calls in neighborhoods like this one to know the real situation was almost never what the dispatch report suggested. Leanne was through the front door before the officers made it to the steps. The few minutes since I had last seen her through the glass had been enough for a transformation. Eyes still carrying the redness, but hair reset, blouse straightened, and her gait now expressing a deliberate, focused urgency. Nothing like the woman who had hurled her phone across the living room. She had assembled a performance and done it fast, which meant the performance itself was something she had been rehearsing long before this particular morning. She aimed a finger at me the instant she came clear of the door. "That man," she said, her voice tuned to the exact frequency of distress that stops short of hysteria. "My father. He came onto the patio during our business meeting this morning and physically attacked my husband. Garrett is inside. He's been hurt. My father has been deteriorating cognitively for months, and this morning he broke completely. He needs to go on an involuntary psychiatric hold before somebody else gets hurt." The lead officer, tall, somewhere in his 40s, hair cropped close, carrying the evaluating stillness of someone who gathers facts before reaching for conclusions, looked past Leanne toward the workshop porch. What he found was a man in a charcoal Savile Row suit, standing with both hands in his pockets, which was almost certainly not what he had pictured at the far end of a psychiatric emergency call. He came toward me at an unhurried, even pace, while his partner intercepted Leanne with a raised palm and a quiet word directing her to wait by the vehicle. "Sir." The lead officer stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "I'm Officer Treadwell, Nashville, Davidson County Police Department. We took a report of a physical assault at this address. Are you Russell Hartley?" I said. "Step inside with me, please. There is something I need you to see before we get into anything else." Officer Treadwell held my gaze for a moment, then followed me up the steps. I opened the workshop door and directed his attention first to the small oval mirror on the wall, then up to the roofline, directly above the frame. 7 months ago, I had 3 security cameras installed on this building, I said. They run continuously and write to an encrypted cloud server administered by my attorney, Owen Bassett. I can give you his contact information right now. The coverage includes the workshop entrance, the back patio, and the side lawn. I met Officer Treadwell's eyes directly. "Everything that took place on that patio this morning is recorded. So is what happened in the kitchen of the main house last night." Officer Treadwell's gaze traveled up to the small black dome set under the workshop, then returned to me. "Last night," he said, "my son-in-law emptied a glass of ice water into my face during a dispute over a legal document. I said, I stayed on my feet. I needed no medical attention. I did not respond in kind. My daughter was in the room and chose not to intervene. The recording shows all of it. I let a beat pass. This morning, I crossed the lawn and delivered a legal document to Garrett Croft. He read it and briefly lost consciousness from the shock of what it contained. At no point did I come within arm's reach of him. From the driveway, Leanne's voice was climbing her account to the second officer, expanding with each pass through it, acquiring detail and urgency, the way a fabricated story does when the audience isn't responding the way the teller needs. Officer Treadwell uncapped his notepad. "You mentioned your attorney controls the footage. A full copy can be on your department's secure server inside an hour," I said. I crossed to the small desk in the far corner, slid the top drawer open, and retrieved a silver USB drive and a business card. What is on that drive is the fraud investigation documentation filed with the State Financial Crimes Division this morning. Over the past 8 months, Garrett Croft forged my signature on loan agreements totaling $2.1 million. My daughter co-signed 3 of those agreements. An active asset freeze order is in place on both of their accounts as of this morning. I set both items on the desk surface. I am not here asking you to take anyone into custody on the strength of my account alone. I am asking you to look at that drive and reach your own judgment. Officer Treadwell examined the drive, then the business card with Owen's name and number. He collected both with the deliberate handling of someone treating them as evidence. Outside, Leanne's voice cut across the driveway at a sharper pitch, demanding that the second officer hear her out, insisting her father posed a real danger, that a serious error was being made. She had moved well past the register of a distressed family member and into something any attentive person could identify, someone straining with considerable effort to hold on to a version of events that had already gotten away from her. Officer Treadwell moved back to the doorway and surveyed the patio across the lawn where the legal documents remained scattered across the stone white pages, vivid against it in the full morning light. He unclipped his radio, spoke 2 sentences into it, and waited. When the response came back, his expression completed a shift out of measured neutrality and into something that looked like professional resolve. "Mr. Hartley," he said, "dispatch has just confirmed an active asset freeze order tied to this address entered this morning through the federal magistrate's office. That materially changes what kind of call this is." He stepped down off the workshop porch. "Please stay put." I remained where I was. Across the lawn, Officer Treadwell moved toward the main house at the steady, deliberate pace of a man who had ceased to be in any hurry. Near the second patrol car, his partner had finally brought Leanne to something approaching quiet. She stood with both arms pulled tight across herself, her ivory linen blouse pale against the gray panel of the vehicle, still speaking voice low and fast, and carrying a desperation that grew more audible with every sentence. The front door of the main house swung open before Officer Treadwell reached the bottom step. Garrett walked out onto the porch himself. He had put on a different jacket. The linen shirt with the stained knee had been swapped out for a fresh blazer, as if a change of clothing might somehow alter what was already unfolding. He came down the front steps with his phone in one hand and his chin held high, his free arm loosely open at his side, the bearing of someone who had concluded that his best play was to appear cooperative and unrattled. He had read the moment entirely wrong. He was certain Leanne had come through. He was certain the officers were there for me. Officers! Garrett's voice carried that particular register, polished faintly impatient, that wealthy men adopt when dealing with people they classify as staff. "Good of you to get here so fast. My father-in-law has been behaving in ways that are difficult to manage, and this morning he walked onto our property and disrupted a meeting with my guests entirely. I'm prepared to give a complete account of events, and I'd request that you speak with my attorney before proceeding." Officer Treadwell raised a single hand. Garrett went quiet. "Mr. Croft," Officer Treadwell said, "turn around and put your hands behind your back." Garrett's expression shifted. "I'm sorry." "Sir, turn around, hands behind your back." The phone nearly got away from him. He secured it, his eyes moving from Officer Treadwell to the second officer who had repositioned himself at the bottom of the steps, then back. The composure he'd walked out with came apart in sequence: the jaw. First then the set of the shoulders, then the guarded evenness of his face opened into something unguarded and exposed. "There's been a misunderstanding here," Garrett said, the Polish gone from his voice now. "Whatever Russell has told you, he's an old man whose thinking has become unreliable. He's made a series of false claims because we stepped in to help him with his financial affairs. Give me the chance to explain it clearly. Let me get my attorney on the phone first." "After processing, you'll have access to an attorney," Officer Treadwell said. "What I need from you right now is compliance. Turn around." Garrett turned around. The sound the handcuffs made, that hard metallic snap, cut clean through the stillness of the October morning and traveled all the way across the circular drive and the manicured lawn without losing any of its sharpness. When the second cuff caught, Garrett's whole body tensed involuntarily, a flinch he had no means of containing. Officer Treadwell's voice was steady and unhurried as he spoke. "Garrett Croft, you are being detained for questioning in connection with aggravated identity theft, fraudulent loan procurement, and filing a false police report. Federal investigators have been notified and are coordinating with this department on the financial crime elements of this case. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Every account Garrett held carried a balance of 0. The attorney he required was as far beyond his reach as the mortgage payment he would never be called on to make. "Hello, Russell." He said it over his shoulder, tilting his head back toward the workshop porch as the two officers steered him down the steps. Gone from his voice were all the layers he had spent years assembling: the decisive developer, the cool negotiator, the man who had once stood in a kitchen and emptied a glass of ice water over a 68-year-old widower just to establish dominance. What the arrest had left behind was someone younger, seeming diminished, stripped down to fear. "Russell, listen, this doesn't have to end here. Name what you want, anything, and I will make it right now today. There's no reason to let this go any further." From the porch I watched him, not with anger, the way you regard something already settled, recognition without any warmth left in it. "I didn't do this to you, Garrett," I said. "You did this yourself. The moment you put pen to paper and started rehearsing my signature." They guided him into the rear seat of the first patrol car. The door shut with a dense, blunt sound that struck the stone face of the $4.2 million house once, and then vanished into the open air. Leanne had taken in the whole scene from her position beside the second car, her palms flat against its side panel, steadying herself. When that door closed on Garrett, something came out of her, not a cry, exactly, not a word, but the sound a person makes when the last thing holding them together gives way all at once. She turned in my direction. I half expected her to move fast across the grass toward me. Instead, she came slowly, unevenly, and stopped at the driveway's edge, about 10 feet below the workshop porch, her face tipped up toward mine. Her eyes were swollen and bare, no armor remaining, none of the careful distance she'd built between us over years. "Dad," the word fractured as it left her the way it had when she was very young and had hurt herself and couldn't reach me fast enough. "Dad, please, just tell me what I'm supposed to do now. Tell me how to put this right. Whatever you ask, I'll do it." The birds had stopped. The second patrol car sat running low and quiet on the drive. From somewhere along the street came the sound of a lawnmower, ordinary, unhurried, belonging to a morning that had nothing to do with any of this. I held my eyes on my daughter's face a good while. "Go inside, Leanne," I said, keeping my voice low. "There's a notice on the workshop door. Everything you need to understand about what happens next is written there." Then I turned and went back inside. The door latched behind me. I lowered myself into the wooden chair next to the workbench and spread both hands flat against the surface, the same worn wood Miriam and I had made together. I held them there and drew in the scent of pine resin and linseed oil. And then, for the first time since the previous night, I let the full weight of the morning settle onto me without trying to hold it back. It was considerable. I had not wished this on my daughter. What I had wished for was something else entirely. I had wanted her to still be the version of herself who perched on the workbench stool and asked me whether wood could feel the moment it became something other than what it had been. I had kept that girl alive in my mind for 2 years, all while she was living 50 FT away in a house where a different person was taking shape, one I no longer knew. Wanting things with your whole heart, Miriam had taught me changes nothing about what is true. I remained in that chair until the vehicles pulled away. Their tires made their sound on the gravel, the gates swung and settled, and by degrees the street outside went back to being a quiet Saturday. Then I got to my feet, smoothed my jacket, and called Owen. Owen's crew came through the rear service gate at 12:40 in the afternoon, 3 men in an unmarked white van, moving with the quiet efficiency of people whose job is to pass unnoticed. The arrangement had been made 2 weeks prior, once I'd accepted that this was all heading somewhere definite, and that I planned to be clear of the property before it got there. From the workshop doorway, I watched them move through the space. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The wooden chair was first out. Then the bench tools sorted into their marked cases, then the books that lined the shelf over the window, then the bedding and clothes from the narrow closet. The oval mirror they handled with care, wrapped fully in padded blankets, 1 man at each end. Last to go was the wooden stool from the corner, the one Miriam had used in 1986, with a battery lantern balanced on an overturned wooden crate at her side and a book open across her knees. 23 minutes from arrival, the van eased back through the rear gate and was gone from sight. I made one last pass through the empty room. Pine walls hold a place's smell, the way seasoned wood holds everything it has absorbed years of labor, of changing light, of people living their days inside it. On the bare concrete floor, you could still read where the furniture had been, faint shadow rectangles marginally darker where the dust had never settled. The window over the workbench sent a bar of afternoon light down to the floor, and it illuminated nothing because there was nothing left to illuminate. Near the baseboard where the braided rug had lain, I knelt and pressed my palm to the boards above the loose plank. The lockbox was long since gone. Owen's team had pulled it that morning while I was out on the patio, but I left my hand there a moment regardless. The memory that arrived was not the one I would have predicted. A Tuesday, March 2018, 8 months before Miriam's diagnosis. She had come out to the Hartley Woodcraft and Design facility on the south side of Nashville to bring me lunch the way she still did from time to time, even then, long after the business had grown to the point where a full kitchen crew worked on site. She settled into the chair across from my desk with a paper bag between us and watched me work through half of a sandwich before she spoke. Then, "Russell," she said, "when this company sells, what do you plan to do with what you get for it?" I set the sandwich down. We'd been going back and forth about the private equity offer for weeks by then, but Miriam had never put the question to me quite so directly. "Take care of you," I told her. "Take care of Leanne. Build something that holds." Miriam unwrapped her own sandwich and considered it a moment before looking up. "Then promise me something. Whatever you build next, build it for people who need it, not for people who simply expect it." "What's the distinction?" I asked. She gave me the look she reserved for when she suspected I was playing dumb. "Russell," she said, "you know exactly what the distinction is." She was right. I had known. I just needed to hear her put it into words so I could carry it the way it deserved to be carried. Miriam had never seen this workshop. The structure itself was new, a storage outbuilding Garrett had converted when we first arrived on the property. But the stool had come from my original space on the west side of Nashville, and the oval mirror had been with us since the first apartment Miriam and I shared. I had brought them deliberately. I wanted something of hers nearby while I waited. I rose from the chair and went to the door. At eye level on its interior surface, I had pinned a single sheet before the morning began. A formal notice to vacate issued by the holding company that had taken control of the foreclosed property. The document informed the current occupants that they had 72 hours to remove all personal belongings from the premises. It described the property as a seized asset under active foreclosure proceedings, referenced the pending fraud investigation, and made clear that failure to comply would bring the Davidson County Sheriff's Department to the door. I unpinned the notice, folded it once, and placed it flat on the bare floor near the center of the room where Leanne would come across it when she came looking. Then I stepped out and pulled the workshop door shut behind me for the last time. The back patio was empty. The catering company had already retrieved their equipment, and the long cedar dining table sat uncovered in the afternoon light. The champagne glasses cleared away. The silver trays gone, nothing remaining of what Garrett had so carefully arranged that morning, except the stone surface and the October air. I went around to the front of the property without passing through the main house. The circular drive sat quiet. Garrett's sports car occupied its usual position, gleaming and purposeless, a machine with no destination and no one left to take the wheel. I climbed into my 14-year-old Camry on the service road, turned the engine over, and pulled away from Belle Meade without a glance at the mirror. I knew what was unfolding behind me. Leanne had gone inside after the patrol cars left, moved through the silent rooms, tried the light switches and found them dead, tried the taps and found them dry. Every utility tied to that address had been canceled that morning, because for 2 years every utility tied to that address had been paid quietly and visibly through the same blind trust that held the mortgage. When I drove away, the infrastructure of their lives went with me. She would eventually walk across the lawn, push open the workshop door, find the empty room and the notice on the floor, and then she would see what I had left on the interior wall next to the doorframe, the one thing I had not been able to take. In the far corner of the wall, at the height of a standing adult, a small carving had been cut into the pine with a pocket knife. 2 letters inside a rough heart, W and D. I had put them there on our first anniversary in the original workshop on the west side of Nashville. When we moved to a larger building, I had cut that small panel of pine free from the wall and kept it for years until I finally had a workshop of my own to set it into. It was the only piece of Miriam I left behind. The Friday after the arrest, Nashville was doing what it does in November, raining with a thin, cold persistence that didn't rise to the level of a storm, but made every outdoor surface gray and cheerless. I had spent the week in a temporary apartment on the 14th floor of a building on Damon Brown Street, while Owen finished the last of the trust transfers and the holding company paperwork. I came through the revolving glass door of Owen's building at 4:20 in the afternoon, my dark cashmere overcoat buttoned to the collar, my mind still on the documents I'd signed moments before. The Hartley Family Educational Trust was now formally established. The foundation was in place. What lay ahead was the detailed work scholarship criteria, dispersal schedules, board appointments, the architecture of something designed to outlast me. I was reaching for my phone to ring the driver when I saw her. She was standing against the granite wall beside the entrance, partially sheltered by the architectural overhang, her arms wrapped tight across a thin beige trench coat that offered nothing against November rain. Her hair was wet and flattened against her face. Gray sweatpants, canvas shoes gone dark with water. The pearl earrings were gone. She had the look of someone who had been standing in that spot for a long time. Leanne pushed off the wall when she saw me come through the door. She took 3 steps in my direction, and then her legs seemed to go uncertain beneath her, and she dropped to both knees on the wet concrete, the impact sharp enough that I heard it from where I stood. Her hands found the hem of my overcoat and gripped it with the force of someone with nothing else to hold. She looked up at me, rain and tears indistinguishable on her face, eyes swollen and red, and as open as I had seen them since she was small. "Daddy," she said, her voice breaking apart on the second syllable. "Daddy, please, please just look at me." I looked at her. I didn't look away. I didn't step back. "I am so sorry," she said, the words arriving in fragments between unsteady breaths. "I am so sorry for all of it. For what Garrett did to you, for what I allowed to happen, for the papers I put my name to, for turning away from you in that kitchen." She pressed her forehead briefly against my coat, then lifted her face again. "I didn't understand what he was doing, Dad. I believed the loans were legitimate. He told me they were a formality, that you had agreed to it verbally, that the paperwork was just procedural. I should have come to you directly. I know I should have. I was afraid of what you might say." I listened to all of it. I didn't cut in once. When she was done, the rain kept at its quiet, indifferent work on the sidewalk around us. A man in a suit passed without breaking stride, stepping around Leanne's knees on the wet concrete with the blank efficiency of someone accustomed to the city. "Leanne," I said. Keeping my voice level required something, though I hope it didn't show. "Tell me one true thing, not what Garrett coached you to say, and not what you think I'm waiting to hear. One true thing." She held my gaze for a moment. Her grip on my coat eased slightly. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. "I didn't know exactly what, but I knew, and I signed anyway because I was frightened of what our life would look like if his business collapsed. I chose the life over you. The last four words came out barely above a whisper. I chose the life over you, Dad. I have known that since the morning I watched him throw that water at you, and I turned away. The cold rain came down steadily around us. From behind me, I heard the smooth sound of a car drawing up to the curb, my driver arriving exactly as arranged. Miriam had always said I kept time like a man who understood its value, which was one of the more charitable ways she had of describing what others called rigidity. I reached into the inside pocket of my overcoat and drew out a small folded piece of paper. I held it out toward Leanne. She released my coat and took it with both hands, opening it with care, her damp fingers leaving faint impressions on the surface. It was the address of a workforce reentry center on North Broadway. A non-profit Owens office had identified one that provided job placement assistance, financial counseling, and transitional housing support for adults working to rebuild after a significant disruption. The center had a strong record and no waiting list. And that is your starting point, I told her. Not me, not anything I have, you. Leanne was still on her knees on the wet pavement, the small folded paper held between both hands. Rain had worked its way through the shoulders of her thin trench coat, darkening the fabric into irregular blotches. Her canvas shoes had gone completely through. She was trembling, not the dramatic shaking of someone in distress, but the finer involuntary kind, the kind a body produces when it has been cold and still for too long and doesn't know how to stop. She read what was written on the paper twice. Then she raised her eyes to mine. "This is a shelter," she said. Nothing in her voice, no anger, no protest. Just the stripped-down fact of the words on the page. "It's a re-entry center. The distinction matters." I kept my voice even. Transitional housing, job placement support, financial counseling. The director is a woman named Nadine Holt. She's guided several hundred people through rebuilding, from circumstances considerably more difficult than the ones you're facing. Owen's office reached out this morning. They know you're coming. Leanne dropped her gaze back to the paper. A raindrop fell from the overhang above and landed near the corner of the page, blooming outward into a dark spot. "Dad?" The word barely made it out, breaking somewhere in the middle of the single syllable. "I understand I have no claim on your generosity. I know that. But what I need you to hear is that I am not who I was when I signed those documents. Every day since, I understood what we had actually taken from you. Every single one, I have been carrying that." I studied her face for a moment. Around us, the November rain came down without drama, the way it does when it has no interest in what's happening underneath it. "I want you to tell me something, Leanne," I said. "The evening Garrett threw that water on me, you were 4 feet away. You saw it, and then you turned your back and went into the next room." I let that sit. What was going through you at that exact moment? Not what came to you afterward. Not how you feel standing here right now. What were you feeling then? Her jaw tightened. Her chin moved. Relief. The word came out in barely a breath. I was relieved it was you he was directing it at and not me. That his anger had somewhere else to land. She shut her eyes. I have never said that to another person. I'm not sure I'd ever let myself see it that plainly before. Her eyes opened again and found mine, and what I saw in them, the raw, unguarded shame, was the most truthful thing her face had offered me in years. "It disgusts me, Dad. The person I was in that room disgusts me." Something moved in my chest. Not forgiveness, I wasn't there, and I couldn't say whether I ever would be in the way she needed, but something adjacent to it. An acknowledgement that the woman kneeling in front of me on the wet concrete was making a genuine effort at honesty, which was more than the woman in the champagne silk blouse and pearl earrings had managed to do. I bent my knees and lowered myself until we were at the same height. At 68, my joints registered their objection, and I set it aside the way I have set aside inconvenient things my whole life. "Your mother cautioned me," I said. "Not specifically about you, about what wealth does to people who haven't been seasoned by it. She could see it taking shape long before I was prepared to acknowledge it." I held Leanne's gaze steady. Miriam was a woman of straightforward appetites. What she wanted was a life with substance, honest work, honest feeling, honest connection. The square footage of the house meant nothing to her. What the dinner guests thought of us meant nothing. She lived that way in front of you for your entire childhood. I paused. At some point, you looked at what she had and decided it wasn't sufficient. I couldn't tell you exactly when that turn happened. I'm not sure locating it would change anything. The tears on Leanne's face had given up, competing with the rain. "I can still picture her in there," she said. "In the workshop when I was small, she'd settle onto that corner stool with a book while you were working. She had this look of complete contentment. I remember thinking it was the dullest way imaginable to pass an afternoon. Her voice came apart. I would trade almost anything to be on that stool right now. I felt Miriam's letter pressing against my chest through the cashmere of my overcoat, through my jacket beneath a weight I had carried every morning since Owen set the envelope in my hands. She loved you without reservation, I said. That was permanent. It wouldn't have shifted no matter what you did. But love and shelter from what you've earned are two separate things. Miriam grasped that distinction more clearly than most people ever do. I got back to my feet, taking my time. The address in that paper, what happens with it, belongs entirely to you. I won't be making that decision, and I won't be present to see it made. That chapter is closed for me. Leanne looked up from the sidewalk, the paper shaking slightly between her fingers. Will there ever come a point, she said, where you forgive me? I thought of Miriam in her hospital bed, asking me to swear I wouldn't let my love for Leanne become something that could be turned against me. I thought of 2 years in the workshop, the same 3 sweaters watching through the glass as my daughter became a stranger. I thought of that small carving, the W and the D, a pocket knife pressed into pine on an anniversary long past. The only piece of her I hadn't been able to carry out when the van left. I don't know, I said. It was the only honest thing available to me. The town car sat at the curb with the engine running, my driver waiting behind the tinted glass. I drew myself upright, fastened the top button against the weather, and took one last look at my daughter. Your mother had a belief she came back to often, I said. That what matters most is whether you can look at the life you've constructed without turning away. She built that kind of life. I built that kind of life. The window for you to build one hasn't closed, but the foundation has to be the truth, not a plan to get to the truth itself starting now. Not once things settle. They won't settle first. I stepped down from the curb. The driver had the door open by the time I got there. I didn't look back as I slid into the warmth of the interior and heard the door seal shut behind me. Through the rear window's tinted glass, Leanne was still down on the wet pavement, both hands clenched around the folded paper, her face tipped down into the rain. The car eased into the traffic moving along Demon Brune Street, and the shape of her on the sidewalk shrank, and then folded into the corner behind us. I turned to face forward and held the silence of the car around me, and did not speak for a long time after that. 2 weeks on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November, I put my name to the last document. The penthouse Owen had secured was on the 60th floor of a tower on South Broadway. Etoile down. 25 minutes from the building, where I had stood a Friday earlier and watched my daughter go down on her knees in the rain. The apartment itself was minimal and light floor-to-ceiling glass along the south and east, faces Nashville laid out beneath it in every direction, the city unfolding in the clean November brightness, steeples, office towers, the broad concrete threads of the highway, exchanges blurring into the horizon. I'd moved in only what mattered, a table and 2 chairs, a bed, the books from the workshop shelves, the oval mirror which Owen's crew had rehung in the hallway at an angle that caught the morning light exactly as it had above the workbench. In the corner of the main room stood the stool from my original space on the west side of Nashville. 3 days earlier, when I first arrived, I had propped Miriam's letter against the base of the lamp on the table. I hadn't touched it since. I wasn't prepared to put it somewhere out of sight. I couldn't say with any confidence that I ever would be. The paper in front of me was the final executed charter of the Hartley Family Educational Trust, a legal document transferring the bulk of my blind trust's holdings into an irrevocable charitable foundation built around one objective: full scholarships for tuition, housing, and living costs for students from low-income households in Davidson County enrolled at 2-year and 4-year accredited institutions. The first group of recipients was set to be chosen in the spring. Owen had projected the trust could sustain between 40 and 60 full scholarships annually in perpetuity based on conservative investment returns. I uncapped the fountain pen Miriam had given me on our 30th anniversary, a simple gold instrument with my initials engraved on the barrel in her handwriting, and signed my name at the bottom of the final page. Russell R. Hartley. My own signature written with my own hand. Nobody had rehearsed it. Nobody had lifted it from a birthday card or studied it off a grocery list or sat at a desk for hours perfecting the particular curve of the H at the top and the way the loop of the final Y dropped slightly below the line. It belonged to me entirely. I set the pen down and looked out at the city. Somewhere to the south, the Belmead property was in the process of being formally transferred to the county following the completion of the foreclosure proceedings. Garrett was awaiting trial on 4 counts of aggravated identity theft and 3 counts of bank fraud, represented by a court-appointed public defender, because every account tied to his name remained frozen. His trial date had been set for March of the following year. Leanne had called Owen's office the Monday after our exchange on the sidewalk. She had made an appointment at the re-entry center on North Broadway for that same afternoon. Owen had relayed this to me, without editorial comment, which was the appropriate thing to do. I had not called her. I did not yet know whether I would. I reached across the table and lifted Miriam's letter. The paper had gone soft at the folds from months of handling the ivory shade deepening at the edges towards something closer to cream. I unfolded it and read it through once more, not out of necessity. Every word had long since settled into memory, but certain things earn the right to be read with intention in decent light without distraction. She had written it on a Tuesday morning in the hospital, 3 weeks before she died. The nurses told me afterward that she had asked for paper and a pen at 6 in the morning and spent 2 hours at it, pausing often to rest, refusing any assistance. She had sealed it herself and given it to Owen with instructions that it reach me only when I opened the lockbox. She had known I would open it eventually. She had known me that well. I read her words in the November light, the city spread out beneath me through the glass. When I reached the final line, the Vietnamese phrase she had borrowed from our old neighbor on Gallatin Pike and made her own, across 30 years of quiet use between us, I said it aloud in the stillness of the apartment. Jung Tsui Jiao, do not bow your head. I folded the letter with care and set it on the table alongside the signed trust documents. Then I reached for the glass of ice water I'd poured earlier, which had been sitting beside the lamp. The glass was clear, the ice barely reduced in the cool apartment air, the water undisturbed. I held it up toward the light the way you do when you want to see a thing clearly. 3 weeks earlier, a glass of ice water had been thrown into my face in a kitchen in Belmead while my daughter looked away. It had run down my nose, soaked my collar, dripped from my chin onto marble I had no claim to. The intention had been to diminish me, to make me feel small and without recourse, to communicate that I was a guest inside someone else's arrangement and could be dispensed with whenever the need arose. I took a slow and deliberate sip. The water was cold clean and tasted of nothing beyond itself, which is precisely what water tastes like when it is not being deployed as an instrument of humiliation. I set the glass down beside Miriam's letter. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Nashville moved through its Tuesday morning with the steady, unsentimental rhythm of a city that does not interrupt itself for individual reckonings. Traffic thickening on the interstate office towers, filling floor by floor, the morning light growing harder as the sun climbed higher. Somewhere out in that city, 40 students who had no knowledge of my name would one day open a letter informing them that their education had been paid for by a man they had never encountered. A man who had built something out of salvaged wood and a second-hand adding machine, alongside a woman who held that what mattered most were the things you made with your own hands. I looked at the stool standing in the corner. I looked at Miriam's letter on the table. I looked at the signed charter of the Hartley Family Educational Trust. And then I did something I had not done in 4 years. Not since the morning the hospital rang and told me to come quickly. Not since I had sat in a parking garage for 40 minutes afterward, unable to put the car in drive. Not since the grief had settled into my chest like weather that had lost any intention of moving on. I smiled, not broadly, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't come from happiness precisely, but from the particular stillness of a man who has done what he said he would do, who has kept the promise he made to the woman whose handwriting lay folded on the table in front of him. I picked up my coffee, settled back in my chair, and watched Nashville come to life 60 floors below, and I let the morning be exactly what it was. I have lived long enough to understand that the most painful lessons tend to arrive wearing the faces of people you love. If this account leaves you with a single thing, let it be this: quiet patience is not the absence of strength. It is strength in its most sustained form. I am not a perfect man. I stayed too long, extended grace too readily, and chose to believe what I wished were true rather than what plainly was. Do not make my mistake. If you've stayed with me this far, then, this wasn't really a story about money or courtrooms or signed documents. It was about what a man does when the people he loved most decide quietly, and then all at once that he no longer matters. I have thought about Russell's story more times than I can count. What it cost him wasn't just property or savings. It was the version of his daughter he had believed in for decades. That kind of loss doesn't leave clean. It leaves slowly, and it leaves marks. I believe God places certain trials in front of us, not to break us, but to show us what we were actually made of all along, Russell found out. And so, in her own time, did Leanne. Here is what I take from this, and what I hope you take too. Do not confuse silence for surrender. The quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who has already decided. If someone shows you who they are in a moment of contempt, believe them. Do not explain it away, because the explanation is more comfortable. Keep building, not for the people who expect it, but for the ones who need it. That is the only kind of legacy that holds. And if you are carrying something right now that feels too heavy to speak out loud, know that patient endurance is not weakness. It is, as these grandpa revenge stories remind us again and again, the longest form of strength there is. These are the father stories that don't make the news, the ones that unfold in kitchens and workshops and rain-soaked sidewalks and end not with applause but with a quiet smile 60 floors above a waking city. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, there are more stories here, and every one of them is worth your time. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.